to talk about there, but I'm Charlie Parker. I'm a very grateful alcoholic. I've been sober since March 22nd of 1985, and I am truly grateful for that. It's funny talking about the COVID thing. Now we have our live PPG meeting going on Tuesday nights, and we do our Zoom meeting on Wednesday nights. But I find myself in the live meeting. I picked up the habit of waving whenever somebody introduces themselves, and I'm like, we're not on the TV anymore, Charlie. It's like, and I found myself waving at Blind Dave one night. I'm like, he can't see you, Charlie. It's like, but habits start quick. My home group is the Primary Purpose Group, Alcoholics Anonymous in Austin, Texas. And we meet Tuesday nights live. If you're ever in town, come see us. 2701 South Lamar, 7:30 p.m. on Tuesdays. And then we have our Zoom meeting on Wednesday nights. And we'd love to see you at that one. I may put the information up on that one, but it's Primary Purpose Group Austin. And we've been having about 300 people at that. It's just been super. And, your first inclination is to feel sorry for somebody that's sobered up in the COVID era when they don't have the gift of the fellowship. But look at what's been available. I mean, to have the kind of horsepower that's available all over the spiritual horsepower, program horsepower around the country, it's a lot of people have been, and we see a lot of that at our Primary Purpose Group Zoom meeting, is people staying up over in Europe till 2 o'clock in the morning because they're just not getting that kind of big book stuff in the meetings they're in. And, I like to say that Alcoholics Anonymous is making a big comeback in AA, and I'm super happy to get to see some of that, because I really think, it's not the uphill battle that it was 25 years ago of trying to, push the idea of being a big book step worker. I don't mind being called some, big book thumper is not my favorite. I think, I was giving a talk at a detox center one time, and I was talking about the turning point. I said, we never ask ourselves where the turning point is. We just read the thing where it says whether to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our insufferable condition, or to accept spiritual help. And I said, we don't ever ask ourselves where the turning point is. I go, it's right there on page 25. And I thumped the book when I did it. And I go, I'll be damned. I've been called a big book thumper before, but to my knowledge, that's the first time I've ever actually thumped it. The guys in detox didn't think it was that funny. I thought it was really ironic and clever, but let's keep going. We use a dictionary at my group. We use a 1936 dictionary to see what a word means or what it meant, and it's just fascinating. Some of those words that I think I know what they mean, but then they come up meaning something different, and I damn sure don't know what compendium means. So I looked it up, and a compendium is a collection of concise but detailed information about a particular subject. I think that's a great name for a meeting like this, because when we do workshops, we can talk 10, 12 hours about the big book and leave a bunch of stuff out. So when you talk for 45 minutes, whenever I get down on it, I rarely regret something I said. I mean, it's always something I forgot to say, where you go, oh, darn it, I meant to mention this piece, or I meant to mention that piece. But we're going to get going into that. I always wear a coat and tie when I speak. It's my training from the very beginning. One of my favorite stories about that, my first sponsor, I was introducing somebody at a conference that was coming in that weekend. And Jim said, Charlie, it's okay if you don't want to wear a coat and tie this weekend at the podium. I said, oh, good. He goes, I mean, you still have to wear one, but it's okay if you don't want to, and there was a lot of stuff like that, where it's like, you can do it under protest if you want, but if you're going to get up there, you're going to wear a coat and tie. And I just, and sometimes I tell Katie, I go, you think I need to wear a coat and tie for this talk? And she's like, are we going to go through this every time you talk? And I'm like, maybe, maybe I don't learn these lessons real quick, but, I'm going to talk a little bit about, for summer, we kicked around some different topics. We landed on, she wouldn't let me do underwater basket weaving. And I had some other topics. I was like, how about how to get other people to make amends to me? that's a pretty good topic. My buddy Danny Brown has a talk where he says, living sober, single, and celibate, and in my mother's basement. That's a that's a good topic, But but we decided to talk about why we work the steps. We were it came up, in a conversation. Summer and I were both on the same meeting. We're like, how about that one? And so I'm going to tell a little bit of story. But in AA, we talk about coming out of our own experience. And I have a joke I like to tell to kind of get us all going. And some of you guys have heard this joke before. Some of you have heard me tell this joke before, but it's a good joke, and I like the way I tell it. And it's about this guy that's he's driving along one day and on this old country road, and he passes this farmhouse, and there's a sign on the fence post that says "Talking Dog for Sale," and he can't stand it. He goes up to the farmhouse, and this old farmer sitting there whittling, and he says, "Hey, buddy, so you got a talking dog for sale?" He goes, "Yeah, he's around back." And the guy wanders out back, and there's this old red hound dog laying there on the ground, and he looks at the dog and he says, "So you can talk?" The dog says, "Well, I certainly can." He goes, "My God, how did that happen?" He goes, "Well, it's actually a really interesting story. So when I was young, I started picking up language skills from the humans that I interacted with. And as I got older, I started developing some of the nuances in the language. I started working with slang and colloquialisms and local expressions. And he says, it's made for a fabulous life for me. I had a 19-year career with the Drug Enforcement Administration and was able to infiltrate some scenes that no human agent would have ever been able to get into. He said, I've traveled the world and stayed in some of the finest hotels, and I've eaten the cooking of some of the world's greatest chefs. But really, more interesting than me, he said, some of my pups have developed foreign language skills and have become international diplomats. In fact, I have 2 pups right now that are in the United Nations as foreign diplomats. And the guy goes, "My God, it's just been fascinating talking to you." And he goes back up front where that farmer's sitting there, and he goes, "Man, how much do you want for that dog?" The guy goes, "I don't know, $40." And he's like, "Why on earth would you ever sell a fabulous dog like that for $40? The farmer thinks for a minute. He goes, "Oh, none of that crap he told you is true." And it's kind of like that around here. It doesn't really matter how good the story is if it's not my experience, because we can smell a line of bull, from a mile away. But I want to get going. I mean, I want to tell just the shortest version of my story is I come from Dallas, Texas. I live in Austin now. Been in Austin for, 45 years. But I grew up in Dallas and come from a fairly normal family. Did well in school, grew up in the Baptist church during the baby boom. My mother was a first grade school teacher. My dad was a salesman. There was no drinking in our home. And I remember that, but I do remember going to church, all the stuff that they were saying that you absolutely cannot do sounded really interesting to me. And most of the stuff I just couldn't wait to do it. And I didn't, I always felt a little separate from, and you're going to hear a lot about that. But there was a couple of things. One, looking back on it, I was an incredibly lazy boy. I can't even think. When I think back about how lazy I was, did anybody ever watch Napoleon Dynamite, the movie? I was watching Napoleon Dynamite, and there's that one scene where they tell him to do something. He goes, "I don't feel like it." And I was like, oh my God, I used to say that all the time. How in the world did I get away with that? And Charlie, go mow the grass. I don't feel like it. It's like, well, we'll be sure and write that down, Charlie, but get your butt out there and mow the grass. But somehow I was able to sell it, and I don't even know how. But I did well in school. And my mother, like I said, my sainted 99-year-old mother, who still lives in a 3,600 square foot house by herself in Dallas, was big on education, big on IQ. There was a lot of talk about IQ and stuff. And 2 things. One is, I think, when I heard him talking about high IQ, I thought that meant you got a free pass. That it was just everything was going to be handed to you, And I can report to you that a above average IQ will get you a front row seat in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I mean, it's like, you know, how I love it. How have you ever noticed how in AA meetings people will say, well, you know, the alcoholic has a higher than average IQ. And you see everybody nodding their head. You only hear that in Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, it's like over at the American Medical Association, they're not there where they're going, wow, did you see Charlie hit that tree the other night? He is a genius, you know. But for whatever I do, I did call my mother one time and say, you know, the book says I'm a genius. It says he has an absolute genius for getting drunk at exactly the wrong time. And I was like, finally some validation. But you know, we talk a lot about separation and this feeling of separateness in society, in the church, in the school, and had to really perform at a high, you know, you hear that expression of an alcoholic being an egomaniac with an inferiority complex, and that nails it pretty good, but I don't know if it totally describes what is wrong with me. I mean, you know, for me, by the time I took my first drink at the age of 13, and I didn't really get started until I was 16. And I didn't, you know, I'd like to tell you that I drank a quart of whiskey from the time I was 16 till I sobered up at the age of 28. But I can tell you this, that it's not true for everybody, but it's true for me. From the time I started to the time I stopped, I don't ever remember turning down the opportunity to get loaded under any circumstance for any reason. A lot of people have much more controlled stories than that. Fred in our big book wasn't like that at all. But for me, I don't ever remember going, no, sorry guys, it's my mother's birthday, or you know, or something like that. It was just like, we'll work it out later, you know, and if something came up, you know, here we go. And I started drinking, you know, and it got, after a while, I started having, you know, it was wonderful. I mean, it did so much for me. But, you know, I started kind of a moral decline, and I really, like I said, I really got going at 16. And it's funny, I mean, you know, in our book on Roman numeral 28, it says our alcoholic life seems the only normal one. I got a great example of that I came up with 2 or 3 years ago. This is going to blow your mind. You want to hear something about our alcoholic life seems the only normal one? Did you know that most people are born, live their whole lives, and die without ever being arrested? I know. I mean, it's like, what? You know, if I called my mother and said, Mom, I can't come over, I got to go see my PO and give a UA because I got a DUI, she would have no idea what I'm talking about. But around here, we're like, oh man, that sucks. Who's your PO? You know, how much time you got? And, you know, but I mean, it really started getting bad. And back to drinking, I mean, I started lowering my academics at school. I started getting involved in a lot of crimes. I didn't get caught for a lot of crimes, but I did start getting caught some. And I started having I wrecked every car my mother ever owned. And, you know, Katie was sitting with my mother one time and she goes, why did you keep giving him your car? You know, and I'm not sure either, you know, but I mean, I just got away with murder. And one night I crashed into a car and I kept going, and I was running back to the bar I'd been drinking in to report the car stolen. And as I was running down the street where the wreck had happened, I saw 2 cops standing there with their flashlights shining. And I thought, my God, they got here fast, you know, and didn't think much about it. I called, you know, reported the car stolen. Now, this is not an extraordinary night. This is just kind of a typical night in the week in the life of Charlie Parker at that time. And but the police called the next morning and they said, Mr. Parker, you're going to have to give a polygraph test to get your car back. I said, why is that? And they said, well, it was involved in an accident before it was reported stolen. I said, you're kidding. And they said, no, they ran into a parked police car. And I was like, I mean, weeks later, I snapped to, that explains how those cops got there so fast, But I mean, Norm Alper used to talk about our lives were saved and changed by seconds and inches. And I mean, when you think about all those breaks I had, if those two cops had been unfortunate enough to be standing there that night when I was leaving that bar, I could have a completely different story. But somewhere along the line, I started losing the power of choice and control. And it talks about it on page 24. It says at a certain point of the drinking of every alcoholic, he passes into a state where the most powerful desire to stop drinking is of absolutely no avail. And then it's interesting there, it says, and we all know the only desire for membership in AA is what? The desire to stop drinking. Right there on page 24, it tells me, desire to stop drinking will get me a seat in AA, but it won't do a darn thing to keep me sober. It says we pass into a state where the most powerful desire to stop drinking is of no avail. We've lost the power of choice and drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. And for me, when I think about having lost the power of choice and control, I think about the pawn shops. I loved pawn shops. Any other pawn shoppers on the screen tonight? Okay. I mean, I loved almost everything about the pawn shops. I loved the purity of the equation. I loved there was never any, I don't ever remember going in a pawn shop and having them go, good God, man, what are you going to do with this money? Or weren't you just here this morning? Or there's nothing like that. You just give them the shotgun, and then they give you the money. And you give them the dare off when they give them the money. And I had a plan. We drunks make some really good plans, and our plans work right up to the point that they quit working. And my plan was that I had 90 days to get everything out of the pawn shop, and I could usually do some kind of a deal in that 90-day period and be able to go redeem everything. Now, one key factor of the story that I have to remember to put in is that I didn't own very much stuff. So I was having to pawn stuff that didn't belong to me. And that puts a little extra heat on the equation, but I still had a plan. We're gonna get it all out. Well, one night, one morning, I pulled an insurance scam that got enough money to get everything out of the pawn shop. I used to drink, but it was also important that I stop by and settle my tab at the Spillway Pub. I used to drink at this little club in Dallas called the Spillway Pub, and they would let me run a $60 tab. This was in 1983. And it was really important to have that tab because I was a little short on credit and constantly broke. And so I'm going to go by and settle my tab. But, we're not going to trigger the phenomenon of craving or anything like that. All that stuff that it talks about what we mean by hopeless state of mind and body. That's all stuff that I've learned since I've been in AA. I promise you, I never walked into the Spillway Pub and went, oh, Bobby, God almighty, the spiritual melody is on me today, and I had a beer on the way over here and it has triggered a phenomenon of craving. Nobody talked like that. That's all stuff that we've learned after we've been here in AA for a while. But I'm a blackout drinker. I go in to settle my tab, and the next thing I remember, it's 5 days later. Now, I didn't have many of those. I had a lot of the hazy memories of driving home or looking out the curtains to see if your car's in the driveway, those kind of blackouts. But this was 5 days, a well-funded blackout. And I came out of the blackout sitting on the edge of the bed at my mother's house, because like any good gangster, we always wind up back at mom's house, and when I come out of that blackout, I can still describe the whole room to you because I'm sitting there on that bed. I passed out with all my clothes on, and in my right pocket, I had $8. And in my left-hand pocket, I still had all those pawn tickets. And I hadn't gotten a darn thing out of the pawn shop. And we've all had those mornings where you're just like, oh no. Because now I'm out of plan and I got nothing and I got nothing. And I shot my wad on that last scam. And I'm not a sociopath. I've worried about it a little bit, studied about it a little bit. not a sociopath. I might be an idiot and completely selfish and self-centered, but I wasn't going to sell my dad's shotgun for $40, or his deer rifle for $60. And so I would have to go to my dad, who was a good man, and say, Dad, listen, if we act now, I can get you a really good deal on all your stuff, but if we wait till tomorrow, it's strictly retail. And, if there's any Al-Anons in the room, believe me, we know that's not funny. But if I touch the desperation of that morning, I'll cry like a little girl in a pink dress up here, because that was me. Because the thing was, when we talk about step one and unmanageability, I would get in the truck with my father and we'd start making the rounds of the pawn shops. And Dallas is a big spread out town. So it wasn't just go to the pawn shop. It was, we got to go up on East Grand and get your deer rifle. We got to go out on Buckner Boulevard and get the metal detectors and your sterling silvers in Oak Cliff. And the metal, everything is in different. And so it's all day in the car with me and my dad and all that shame. And when we'd be driving around, I'd be going, Dad, listen, I swear to God, I will never do this again. I don't want to feel like this. I don't want you to feel like this. I will never do this again. And if I was lying to that man, I damn sure didn't know it at the time, because it felt like I meant it with every fiber of my being. But within 3 days, I'd hit the back door of his house like a cat burglar. And it'd just be like that, and off we'd go again. And by the time I got to you fine people, my father and I had made the rounds to the pawn shops 3 times. And that's just the times I couldn't pull it together and get everything out. That's how cool I was. That's how slick I was. I was a burden to anyone who loved me or was unfortunate enough to care about me. That's the man I brought to Alcoholics Anonymous. And when we said, why do we work the steps? I was sound asleep, had no idea why things were going the way I was, and couldn't figure out. Mark Houston was my sponsor for several years before he died. And he used to like to say, how do you know what you don't know? And when I came to AA, I was one of the lucky ones. I loved the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous from the very beginning. And I thought, for a long time, I'm sober 37 years. For a long time, I thought everybody loved the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's not the case. In fact, we've had people in big conferences, raise your hand if you just loved AA when you got here. And it seems like it's about 15%, and it's a real advantage to feel right at home in that fellowship, because it bought me some time. I was able to, go to the meetings and do that stuff, but in my early AA, my approach to the steps was not entirely meeting based, but the approach to the steps was pretty simple. And it was basically like, are you alcoholic? We didn't spend a lot of time talking about what that means with the hopeless condition of mind and body and the spirit, the mental obsession and the physical allergy and the things that make me powerless over alcohol and hopeless and that sort of thing. And that drives me into step 2, that experience in step 1. But looking back at it from what I see now, I think in the early days, Alcoholics Anonymous was a recovery program with a support fellowship. And somewhere over the next 40 or 50 years, we kind of turned into a sobriety fellowship with a somewhat optional recovery program. I don't think our founders ever dreamed that there would be a time that somebody would be able to stay sober for any considerable period of time by just going to AA meetings. And, I don't worry so much about some of the people that were coming in during the COVID era, but I did worry a little bit about the meeting makers make it crowd, because because the thing that happens when you have what we call meeting-based sobriety is not doing too good. I go to the 5:30 meeting and somebody talks about fear, and I got fear, so we talk about fear, we relate to fear and that sort of thing, and I get a little relief. And then I go back out in the world, living a life based on self-will, And by 5:30 tomorrow, by God, I need another meeting, and we'll talk about resentment that night. But so what happens is I get a little relief. I go back out in the world. I come back and get a little relief. So I keep getting relief, but I never experience the freedom that's available as a result of getting unblocked and connected in this program, which is what's available, And so, I mean, I went to treatment in 83 and I don't know. I mean, I saw the best cartoon the other day. It showed a guy talking to the sponsor. And the sponsor says, "How long do I have to work these steps?" And the sponsor said, "Until you die from something else." And I thought, that's pretty good. But hold on just a second. Okay. So the first time in the steps, it was a really different process. It was basic, like, are you alcoholic? Do you believe in God? And then get down on your knees and do the third step prayer. And if that happens, you skip this body of work on pages 60 to 63. And that was what happened for me this time. And that's what we talk when we talk about, why do we work the steps? I think my initial thing was working the steps to try to get sober and stay sober, and when you work in a program like the problem was alcohol, and I did that for a long time, and it seems like it makes sense, it's Alcoholics Anonymous, for God's sake, seems like if I'm not drinking, I should get an A. And not drinking is a big part of our recovery program. But when you work in a program like the problem is alcohol, lines like this on page 19 are kind of startling. It says, "We feel that the elimination of our drinking is but a beginning." Check this out. "A much more important demonstration of our principles lies before us in our respective homes, occupations, and affairs." I'm sitting there reading that, and I'm going, how can it be a more important demonstration of our principles than not drinking? But then it talks about that all, it says there's another part in the book where it says, they're very kind. They say, we feel a man is unthinking when he says that sobriety is enough. That's a good word to use with the sponsee sometimes. Like, I think you might be unthinking there, It's like, but my ex-wife was talking to her sponsor one time about what she was thinking, and her sponsor goes, "Oh, Sherry, I envy the growth before you." And I was like, oh man, that's a good line. It's like, you have so far to come, but me too, and so the thing that happened was my life gets better, and physical sobriety starts to look like recovery. Because when you run it like I do and you stop drinking, you can work and you can not blow all the money and not have to give your money to lawyers, and things get a lot better. But I don't know why I feel like kicking the cat all the time, or just a little restless and irritable and discontented, and that's an understatement. So my things were a lot better, but I mean, I started hitting walls in sobriety. I hit a wall at 4.5 years of sobriety. That's when I blew up my first marriage. And I didn't know what was going on. I certainly wasn't part of my principles. I grew up that you only get married one time, but I wasn't capable of that. This marriage just exploded in my hands. And I'm at 4.5 years sober. And I went and heard Bob B from St. Paul, Minnesota. It was the first time I ever heard anybody talking about having significant problems in sobriety, and it's kind of an emerging message in AA. But when I hit a wall at 4.5 years. I hit a wall at 7 years. I hit a wall at 17 years. And I had this big awakening. I had my biggest spiritual awakening at 17 years of sobriety. But the funny thing about it was I went all over the place talking about this big awakening. This wall I'd hit at 17 years, like it was the last wall I was ever going to hit, until I ran up against 32 years, and it brought me to my knees. I mean, I had about 5 crises hit me at once at 32 years, and it was more than self-will could handle at the time. It calls for, a new level, so, but at 17 years, big stuff happened. I'd been in a plane crash. I got out of another marriage. And, I really think it's the most interesting part of my story. But I came back to Austin and I started hooking up with some people because I knew I was in trouble. I couldn't really put my finger on it. I'm 17 years sober. And, it's a dangerous time. A lot of people hit walls at the time, and some of them drink or blow their brains out, and some of them, and I can't always tell the difference. But I remember calling up this guy and I go, John Henry, brother, I am so self-centered. I can't even be in a conversation with somebody. I just have to force myself to go, hey, Robert, how are the kids, and act like I give a flip about the answer, because I just don't. I'm just so self-obsessed that, I have to make myself ask the right questions that normal people ask, and I don't really understand that that's part of the program. But when I come back in, I hooked up with Myers. Some of your speakers that are coming up, I hooked up with, I 12-stepped a friend of mine into a treatment center in Central Texas. And he hooked up with this one-eyed guy there named Chris R. And then he introduced me to his twin brother, Myers. And Myers took me through the steps. And then we did work together for a little while. And I'm starting to understand that there's people working this program at a different level than what I had ever experienced in those first 17 years. And I thought I was a big book guy. But I knew I'd been drifting for a while. So when I come back in the hour and a half I have left, I want to talk about this new experience that I had with the steps. That's just a joke. I was just seeing if you're paying attention. Sometimes I like to check, see if everybody's looking at the little boxes on their screen. This is my imitation of somebody at an AA meeting in 2021 or 2022. And you're like, dude, you got to be more subtle about it. You're creeping me out, so I come back in, and then Mark Houston comes into my life, and somewhere along the line, I got a different approach to stuff. Turns out there was more available, and that's a big question to ask yourself. Is it possible that there's more available? Is it possible that there's a power that can move me beyond where I am right now at whatever period of sobriety I'm at? And so I started going back through the book and working with people. Turns out step 1 meant something way different than I thought it meant. And we really hammered home the first step experience and the physical allergy coupled with the mental obsession and what we mean. And that moves me into a thirst for the power. My experience has been that if you take the time to give a person a step 1 experience, this hopeless, what I call a fatal dose of alcoholism, it funnels us into the rest of the program, and it opens up to everything. But if we throw the doors wide open and don't take the time to tell a guy what's wrong with him, why he's here, what we mean, and you see guys have that step 1 experience, and they lean forward and go, my God, you're explaining a lot of stuff I've never been able to explain before, And so we go on, but it seems like the stronger the step 1 experience is, the less work we have to do in step 2. On page 27, it says, we in our turn sought the same escape with the desperation of a drowning man. You know what's cool about working with drowning men? They don't ask a lot of questions. If I'm drowning and you pull up in a boat, I'm not going to go, pardon me. Before we proceed, I just have a few questions. I'm not sure I really believe in your boat. This is not my favorite boat, and, do you have any other boats that aren't blue, and it's just help me, but what happened was the big book takes a right turn on page 60 that I missed for 17 years. I think it's one of the biggest mistakes being made in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous is this: are you alcoholic? Do you believe in God? Get down on your knees and do the third step prayer. And if you do that, you skip this body of work on pages 60 to 63. It's not really that important. It's just the root of my problem and the basis of my recovery for the rest of my life. Other than that, just skip it, and it just, so this, I call it the self piece, because it says the first requirement of step 3 is that I be convinced that my life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Well, not only was I not convinced of that had never touched me, because we had skipped right from see that God can and would if we saw it to the third step prayer. And I used to be embarrassed to talk about it till I realized how much company I had. It's a very common experience in Alcoholics Anonymous to just skip right to that prayer and skip the self piece. And, it just changes everything. I mean, the book, like any spiritual literature, just goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And, God loves me enough to accept me right where I am, but he loves me too much to let me stay there, and the more we dig into this work, the deeper it goes and the more it opens up and the more it opens up. And why do we do this? Why do we work the steps? Well, I mean, in my experience, the people I relate to the most and the people that I admire the most in Alcoholics are the people that work the steps because we have to. We work the ones that work the steps because I'll go ape if I don't. You let me get separated long enough, and all of a sudden, I think that guy just gave me a look, or my boss is an idiot, and the guy working the door at Sam's Club is a moron, and whatever it is, and and that rest of that untreated alcoholism, as it's described in the Benevolence on page 52, is available well into sobriety, and Mark Houston went to the nut house at 9 years sober behind untreated alcoholism and PTSD from the Vietnam War. But I mean, somebody that's been driven to that point will work the steps with a new energy. And but I mean, the funny thing is, I observe so much of myself and my sponsees of drifting in sobriety. I get a little relief, and then I'm back. It's like I don't need all the relief, just enough to where I don't feel like screaming or killing myself. And then we back off. And I'll work the steps. I get the relief. I'll pray and meditate for for a little period of time. And I mean, my sponsees who've heard me talk about these flat periods in sobriety, who've heard Katie and I talking about having this big awakening at 17 years and what it does. And sometimes I think when they sit in the Thursday night meeting at my house, that I'm glad that, that I got to hear this message so I won't have to experience that. And then you watch them walk face first into the bus, and you see them pulling away. And all of a sudden, the gifts of sobriety start to pull us away from recovery. And all of a sudden I don't have time, to make the meetings, to work with the new guy, to take the service commitment, to actually work the steps. I approve of the steps in theory, but I just don't really, you go ahead. And one of the biggest things I worry about in recovery is AA becoming theory, where it's like, here, take my advice. I'm not using it, might as well. And it's a subtle trap that we can fall into even when I'm writing the inventory. I can take my ego through this process and come out the other end of it unchanged if I'm just taking my ego into it. And I realized that one day when I was sitting here, I'd done inventory on somebody that I had a resentment. I put them in column 1. I put what they'd done in column 2 and how it affected me in column 3, and then did the sick man exercise where I tried to look at it from their perspective and look at it from an entirely different angle. You know, how could this story be told different? And then I went, wow, man, I was really selfish about this, and I have much better perspective on it now. And I was delusional to think they were going to be thinking of me. And you know, the things that come out in the fourth column, and then I went, oh boy, I'm glad I wrote some inventory on that. I really feel a lot better, and I'm ready to stand up. And I went, good grief, God didn't have anything to do with that piece of inventory. You know, I can take the inventory process and turn it into an exercise in self-will, because it's just, and it's very subtle. I don't see it happening, you know, but I mean, when I have some sponsees that if I didn't call them, I don't know if they'd be connected to our little group at all, you know, and I'm not above calling a guy that I haven't heard from in a little while, because, you know, we got to keep that contact up. But I mean, you know, when we start getting separated, you know, it's funny, when Mark used to have much time, oh, good grief. This self piece changes everything. I don't have enough time to talk a lot about the amends process. Had a magnificent experience in the amends process after Mark Houston showed up. And I can't more highly recommend making a list of all your amends and actually make it. I mean, getting with somebody that's familiar with the amends process and letting them guide you through how to do this. But then with all that, we get unblocked in steps 4 through 9. And then we try to stay unblocked in steps 10 and 11. And an active 10th step is a game changer. Actually watching for where am I selfish? Where am I dishonest? You know, and one of my favorite stories recently was there's a guy that started sponsoring when he had about 19 years, and he was in trouble. And we do real active 10 steps and evening review and morning prayer meditation. But he was talking one day and he goes, then I got with Charlie's group and I started doing advanced AA. I'm like, uh-oh. And he goes, and it turns out advanced AA is really basic. You know, it's like, what if we actually did the stuff that the book is recommended? You know, what if we, you know, forget saying to ourselves many times each day, how about once a day, thy will, not mine, be done? You know, taking a vision of God's will into some of our activities. How much better would our lives be if we just actually practice the program the way it's laid out for us? And I mean, that's why we work the steps, is because there's more and more available. And otherwise, this stuff just kind of turns into head knowledge. And I want to close with a writing that I got from C.S. Lewis. And because when we talk about what we're willing to settle for in recovery, and how we won't turn it around, even when I know I'm drifting, check this out. It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. I'm Charlie Parker. I'm alcoholic. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Charlie.